This is a Founding Media podcast, produced at Austin Community College District. Welcome back to Science in the Mall, y'all. I'm your co-host, Dan Dillard, alongside my co-host, Nancy Lyon. Ever heard of PCR testing? Our guests today are working hard to revolutionize this diagnostic tool that we all got to know so well over the last 2 years of the pandemic. Nancy and I are excited to invite Liz Hampton and Barrett Morrow onto the show today, who both work for a diagnostics company, Nuclein. If you missed our interview with Nuclein on season 1, Barrett and Liz give us a recap of what Nuclein does, and Barrett shares what it's like to be a first hire at a biosciences startup. Liz and Barrett talk about the hiring process and the unique experience of working at a startup diagnostics company during a pandemic. They share the growth that Nuclein has experienced and what a day in the life is in expanding the company. This conversation was so great, we had to cut it into 2 parts. So without further ado, let's dive into part 1. You were both at Nuclein's early days when it was incubating at ABI. Which one of you started to work in there first?
I began first. I was hired in December of 2019 as Nuclein's first full-time employee that's not a founder. So technically the first employee was a gentleman by the name of Mike Tarbird, but he's also a founder. So I don't know if you would consider him the first employee or not. But
yeah, it was just Mike for almost 3 years in that incubator.
It's true. It was super weird to have just one guy.
It was funny when I started, he said to me, he's like, hey, I've been working alone in this room for the past 3 or 4 years. I'm not used to having coworkers now, so if I seem a little weird the first couple of days, just know it's because I'm not used to working in a room with other people. So I was like, okay, man, But yeah, I ended up at Nuclein. So I used to work in the lab of Andy Ellington at UT campus. So a little bit of background for me. I went to UT, did research there, graduated in 2017. And then I worked as a research technician for 2 years in Dr. Ellington's lab. And Nuclein was looking to grow. And Mike Tarbird, and Andy Ellington was on Mike Tarbird's doctoral committee for his PhD. And so just, when Mike was looking to hire his first person for Nuclein, he was just reaching out to social circles he knew. And he sent an email to who at the time was my boss saying, hey, we're looking for a entry-level scientist position for this point-of-care diagnostic company. Do you know anyone who's interested? My Dr. Ellington, knowing that during my undergrad, I was very involved in research, specifically research tailored around diagnostics and kind of cheap, portable, do-it-yourself diagnostics. He ended up forwarding me that email, and the rest is history.
You mentioned that you almost didn't apply. Can you just talk about the feelings you had about when you received that notice?
I think a lot of people, when they're coming out of undergrad, you don't know what you want to do with your life. It's kind of a big question to grapple with. And I kind of had a really bad behavior of, I would read a job description and I would immediately think of all of the reasons why that job wouldn't be the right job for me, or how I would hate it, or, whatever. I would focus on the negative and not the positive. And it was actually a conversation with my dad where I described the opportunity to him. In his own words, he said, Barrett, you would be an absolute idiot if you don't apply for that job.
Thanks, Dad.
That's what dads are for.
And so on the heels of that encouragement, I applied. But I went through 5 rounds of interview to get my job at Nuclein. And I think that has now changed. I think I was the only person that was put through that amount of torture.
How many did you get, Liz?
Just one interview, and it was through Skype, and I was applying for a part-time position.
Right. I remember that.
But after each round of interview, having so many rounds, you think about the pool of people you're competing against, and when you think there's 5 rounds of interviews, you're like, holy crap, I'm competing against like 60 people for one job.
Right.
And at the end of each interview, even though every time it felt like it went well, the negative thoughts would creep into my head thinking, surely there's someone more qualified than I. And that feeling persisted up until through the very last interview. It was actually on Thanksgiving Day of 2019 that I got a call saying, "Hey, we'd like to offer you the job." And I was just blown away. I was like, "What? Me? Are you sure?"
Do you think they do that just to make people squirm? Is that just this?
That's exactly what I was thinking. Is like it'd probably be more than likely that Alan or Rich or Mike, whoever called him, just didn't realize it was Thanksgiving. They were probably in the lab and they're like, "Oh, hey, let's offer Barrett a job."
Well, I'm more like to make you go through 5 interviews. Is this like, are you trying to torture people, or is it their own imposter syndrome? Right? They're like, "Oh, I don't know if I know how to pick somebody. Let's meet him one more time, just in case."
Maybe.
Well, and the tidbit that Barrett always says that cracks me up is he would like overthink one of the interviews was at a restaurant or something, and he was overthinking what he was going to order, if it was too much or.
I had memorized the entire menu at the final restaurant where we were having an interview, because it was a restaurant that serves really expensive steaks, but also cheaper lunch items. So I had a little map in my head made where, I was going to defer ordering and let everyone else order first. And then I would order based on what they ordered. And so I was like, okay, if they get a steak, then I'll also get something expensive. But, if they get, like a club sandwich, no way in hell I'm going to order a steak, So it was definitely a lot of overthinking going on,
Were all 5 interviews at restaurants? I'd be like, "Oh,
No,
do you need a 6th interview? We can do that."
Only the last 2.
Well, I think it's important to share that piece of the puzzle, or that piece of the process, because as listeners listen in, they're going to be doing the same thing. They're walking the same journey. They've got interviews they're nervous about. They may not be applying, and it may be this same syndrome, this imposter syndrome, or just fear that they're looking at. So you being able to share that experience, I think is really awesome. Were you both? Was COVID already going on when you both jumped into this? I guess not for you, Barrett. But what about you, Liz? Was COVID going on when you started working with them?
I think I was the first post-COVID hire. There was one guy, a Mike Gurman, in between Barrett and I that was hired. And then I'm pretty sure my hiring was a response to COVID. They were going to switch to COVID testing instead of what they were working on previously. So I'm pretty sure that's how the job offer came about.
Well, and I didn't have, she was working with me, and we were closing, like not closing, but I couldn't have students in anymore. And so it was a great transition for her, because she could just step out of the incubator and into Nuclein.
Right. It was a good timing, right? Because I think for the pandemic, I got like 6 weeks of being able to stay at home and not doing anything. And it was just enough time for me, because Nancy pushed me Nuclein's way when it started. And I remember specifically replying an email to her where I was like, look, even my parents right now are like, hey, do you want to move back? We don't know how long this is going to be. They live up in the DFW area. So when Nancy first introduced Nuclein to me, I was like, I'm going to see if the world ends first. And then 6 months later, I think I emailed her and was like, hey, I want to apply because I need a job again. It's boring.
You got 6 weeks? I got 0.
Hey, man,
I know.
You had to work up your spitting skills.
Well, and all my friends had a year, and I was like, dude,
Yeah, we never got to enjoy the work from home craze.
We got to enjoy the no traffic in Austin phase.
Right. What was that like, Barrett, for you when you witnessed, you came in pre-COVID? How did COVID impact the point of care diagnostic industry?
I hate to say it, it's the best thing that's ever happened to the point of care diagnostic industry, because it has cemented molecular diagnostics' place as a fundamental need for our society to function as we know it today. What's really weird with Nuclein is when COVID first happened and we were first hearing reports about it in late January, early February of 2020, we kind of talked internally and decided that COVID was something we were not going to focus on. This hopefully will be something that, in the next news cycle, will be forgotten about. And it was probably mid-March when, right around the time the stock market crashed and it was first starting to show up in the U.S. And we kind of realized, we kind of asked ourselves, are we really a diagnostic company if we don't go after COVID? And so the decision was made to then switch to making a COVID diagnostic. And I can say with certainty that COVID accelerated the growth of Nuclein exponentially. I think the plan with my initial hiring was for it to be just me and my boss Mike for quite a while. But then when COVID, happened, the timeline and the need to get a diagnostic on the market was, larger than ever. And so, it almost felt like every passing day that we didn't make progress or, didn't get closer to making a final product, at least to me personally, it felt like, I felt somewhat guilty, kind of like, I don't know if cancer researchers feel the same way, but it's like, people who make new drugs, it's like, every day they're not making progress towards a new drug, there are cancer patients that are dying. And I kind of felt the same way towards making a COVID diagnostic. It's probably not the healthiest way to think, but, if you really care about what you do, then that's kind of the unavoidable thought.
Since then, I guess Nuclein obviously has outgrown the incubator. So what's it like now at Nuclein?
It's so funny. Sometimes I feel like it's almost exactly the same, but with 10 times more people, 20 times more people. And like at this point, it feels like people aren't having to wear multiple hats like we were when it was just a few of us, but there's still just as much to do. When we did the pre-interview, I was, working, I was hourly, but I was not part-time, right? Like when school wasn't a thing, I was averaging about 45 hours a week on the clock, and I was clocking out, right, for like lunches and stuff. So it didn't feel any different. There was just more people around doing a lot more of the same thing, except when it comes to the actual device. Working with what we have now compared with how it looked when I started is a absolute quantum leap in just the technology and how well it works. And it really is slowly approaching the point where, I know a whole lot about the little pieces of it, but it's starting to work to a point where you push a button and it goes, and that it's so neat,
Yeah, and to kind of highlight, just how much Nuclein has grown. We moved from the ACC space once we had four, me, Mike, and Elizabeth.
Four on site. And then they have a bunch of like engineer team and stuff. But
Yeah,
four
they
on
don't
site.
count.
Except for they were coming in and out a lot.
So then we moved to a space not too far down the road, what we thought was going to be our home for, the foreseeable future. And, we just kept growing like weeds, it just every week it felt like a new person was starting. And, we moved in August of 2020,
Right.
2020. And then in August of 2021, we moved again to a much larger space. And we're hoping that we stay here a little bit longer than we did at our last place. I mean, we've invested the time and money to put up this beautiful sign here. But it has been a roller coaster, and it's been very interesting, especially as the first employee, to just kind of see how a company grows and kind of the pains and joys that come along with that.
It seemed so huge when I went over there. I mean, like Mike had me come over and see their new space. They built a lab, which is, the dream, right? That's what the incubator is all about, is incubating these companies so that they can go out and buy their own lab and, keep it going. And it was huge. And there was only a small part of it that they had, turned into a lab. There was still this huge other part. And he's like, well, we haven't figured that part out yet. And the next time I talked to him, oh yeah, we moved because we outgrew that space. And I was like,
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
And that's got to feel good for you, Nancy, is just to see something start like from one person there at ACC, and all of a sudden, how many employees is it now? Like you said, 60? Is it 30 or 60?
Right now on our company Slack, there are 49 people on the Slack.
Those are the people that pay attention. There's probably others that aren't on the
exactly.
Slack.
Those are the people
Slack.
that pay attention. There are lots of other, consultants or people that are in, smaller roles that are not in that official number. But
we've touched on what Nuclein does, but can you just kind of give us an idea of what a day in the life is at Nuclein for you?
Bring on the spit.
I can go first there. Initially a day in the life at Nuclein, a day in the life 2 years ago is very different to a day in the life today. A day in the life 2 years ago, there was much less structure. It was kind of up to the individual to figure out what they needed to get done. Now there's a lot more structure. We're defined into groups. We have managers. It's a more structured environment now. But me personally, I'm in charge of manufacturing a lot of reagents that we use internally, as well as kind of just doing device runs and device research. So qPCR right now is ran, or PCR for COVID testing right now is usually ran on a very expensive instrument. And they cost like $50,000. And so that we kind of use that instrument as our gold standard, our control for our experiments. So that's the comparator for the output of our device. So, we'll set up an experiment and run a bunch of devices and then compare that data to the data that comes off of the 7500 is what it's called, to, help us make sense of the data. But it's really just a lot of rapid thinking, proposing what a problem is, testing to see if that's a problem or if you found a solution to the problem, and then either fixing the problem, finding out that problem was actually not a real problem, it was a different problem, or lastly, finding an even bigger problem and completely diverting your attention to the even bigger problem. So I'll let Elizabeth pick it up from there.
Yeah, I'm curious because I don't know what your role is over there, Liz.
Oh man, me neither. So before I left for school, I knew basically that my day would be, I had some time in the morning and some time late in the evening to do kind of a short list of things. I would still kind of be the one to, I wasn't doing inventory anymore. That was my main thing when I was hired. But that has since moved on to Tina, who was also an intern with me at the time with Nancy. But I still kind of have a lot to do with the device runs. So when I show up to Nuclein now, I kind of know who my team leads are. So I just ask them if they have any experiments that they're planning. And if they don't, I then go around to everyone else. And kind of while Barrett was talking, the one thing I think about now is we're enough people that Barrett might tell me that he needs a device run of about 12 experiments in the morning, and I could straight up run those 12 devices and I still won't see him until the end of the day. We're in separate rooms, and because Barrett will be developing the assay, right, building it in its pieces through through one set of rooms we have specifically built for mixing up the assays that we use, and then we have a totally separate room, literally through a pass-through window, that is used to actually start, run, and amplify. And that's usually where I'm stuck for most of the day. And it's really, I'm in that room because that's what I've wanted to do. All right. I'm interested in the biology side of everything, but it's always the tech that's gotten me interested in anything. So I will take what they hand me, which is really just a piece of device that has the experiment in it. I don't really know a better way to say that, right? It might, we don't really mess around with the assay parameters anymore, but it might be different concentrations of what we're trying to amplify. It might be different settings of PCR, but whatever it is, I will turn the device from what they hand me to one that can actually run, which at this point is really just hooking it up to the equipment that actually runs it, right? Like any sort of circuitry, or starting the device itself, or inputting the parameters for the PCR run. And I start them, and then I make sure they don't blow up.
Yeah, but a good analogy is I assemble and oil the engine, and then I give the engine to Elizabeth, and she puts it in the car and gets the car to go.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and that's the kind of the great thing, but also the crappy thing about developing a PCR assay is PCR is so dang sensitive that it can detect a single copy of DNA, which
we have on our hands and in our
PCR. A PCR reaction generates trillions upon trillions of zillions of DNA copies, and so in our laboratory we actually have to have different rooms with different air pressure settings to where the room where PCR is happening, there is always air being exhausted to the outside environment to prevent any, if there's a leak, for example, the absolute worst thing that could happen in our laboratory is for that leak to somehow become, dispersed in the air and make its way out into our general laboratory. And so, that's what Elizabeth was describing, where we have these rooms with these pass-through windows, and it's really just to help maintain cleanliness and to prevent, contamination from happening, which is definitely a problem that we've faced and all diagnostic companies face.
So are you worried about contamination of your samples or contamination of COVID on your people?
We are worried about contamination of amplicon because, DNA is forever. Contamination of COVID, as long as it's inactivated, it's not live virus, is not as big of a concern because it's RNA, and so it's more labile and it will be degraded quicker. I mean, it's obviously still a concern, but if you get 10 to the 10 copies of cDNA out in your laboratory, I mean, short of UVing every square millimeter, you're kind of hosed.
Thank you so much for joining us, Barrett and Liz. This was an awesome episode. They gave us a glimpse into those COVID tests we've all been using so much over the last couple of years. It was cool to hear about bioscience startup life and all the exciting opportunities that abound there. It's enlightening to learn what companies look for in their hiring process, and even more encouraging to learn that we all struggle with imposter syndrome from time to time. Tune in to part 2 to learn more about the intersection of business and biotech and the importance of seizing opportunities. Thanks for listening, and see y'all next time. This has been a Founding Media podcast produced in partnership with Austin Community College's Bioscience Incubator, which is the region's only wet lab space for Austin's growing bioscience industry.